Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into the incredibly complex plumbing of the human urinary system. But more importantly, we're breaking down the highly specific medical coding rules that actually map it all out. If you're looking to translate biology into the language of medical billing without missing a single beat, well, you're in exactly the right place. Let's get into it.
Think about it like this. The body's urinary tract, when it's working perfectly, is an absolute masterpiece of efficiency. It expertly prevents the buildup of wastes and extra fluid, it keeps your electrolytes perfectly stable, and it even helps regulate your blood pressure. It just perfectly eliminates bodily waste. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Incorrect medical coding for these precise procedures, that can create massive administrative waste. We're talking lost revenue, denied claims, and compounding inefficiencies just because our paperwork doesn't match the body's natural precision. So our goal today is to bridge that gap.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. First, a quick urinary system anatomy overview, followed by renal pelvis percutaneous rules. Then we'll look at cystograms and bladder imaging, dive into the VCUG voiding variable, explore retrograde procedures, going against the flow, and finally, we'll finish up with antegrade studies and new access.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Urinary System Anatomy Overview.
So, the production and excretion of urine follows a very specific logical path. First up, the kidneys create urine from waste products and fluid in the body. Second, bad fluid flows from the kidneys straight down through the ureters. Third, it arrives right at the bladder where it's stored temporarily. And finally, the bladder empties through the urethra. Understanding this physical path from creation down to the exit is absolutely crucial. It's the key to understanding how minimally invasive percutaneous procedures are performed to evaluate and treat problems, essentially replacing those older open procedures.
Moving right along to Section 2, Renal Pelvis Percutaneous Rules.
Let's start this section with a foundational definition. A nephrostomy is a surgically created channel through the renal parenchyma and into the renal pelvis. Now, why do we actually need this? Well, this vital procedure provides access for things like urinary diversion, catheter insertion, or gaining access to the upper urinary tract to dilate a stricture or remove a calculus. So a percutaneous nephrostomy specifically means we're inserting a catheter through this channel under the guidance of fluorography or ultrasonography. But the big question is, how do we actually code this access?
Here is a huge trap you need to avoid. When coding these procedures, the renal pelvis and its associated ureter are considered a single entity. Yep, you treat them as one connected structure. This means you code only once for each renal pelvis and ureter accessed. You simply cannot double dip just because the instrument passed from the pelvis directly into its connected ureter. Make sense?
Now, this single entity rule actually makes a lot of sense when we look at anatomical variations. For instance, say a patient has a biological variation where they have unilateral duplicated ureters, meaning two ureters on just one side. If both are accessed, the appropriate code may actually be reported twice. And this is exactly the same logic applied to standard bilateral procedures, where you access both the left and right sides. In a bilateral scenario, the codes are also reported twice, or just once using modifier 50. It really all comes down to how many distinct anatomical pathways you're actually entering.
All right, on to Section 3, Cystograms and Bladder Imaging.
So a cystogram is essentially an imaging study of the bladder. But from a coding perspective, to capture all the work that's being done, we have to break it down into individual components. A standard cystogram involves catheterizing the bladder, injecting a contrast medium, and then doing the actual imaging. For the injection procedure, you're going to assign code 51600. And right alongside that, for the radiological supervision and interpretation, which by the way requires a minimum of 3 views, you assign code 74430. You absolutely have to capture both the surgical injection and the radiological interpretation components to get the complete picture.
Which brings us to Section 4, the VCU voiding variable.
Timing is literally everything here. We just talked about code 74430 for your standard imaging, which applies if the images are taken after the patient voids, but not during. But if images are actively taken during voiding to evaluate both the bladder and the urethra, well, the supervision and interpretation code strictly changes to 74455. This is known as voiding urethrocystography, often just called a voiding cystogram, voiding cystourethrogram, or simply a VCUG. The contrast injection code stays exactly the same at 51600, but catching that active voiding, that completely shifts your radiology code.
Next up, Section 5, Retrograde against the flow.
Now we're talking about retrograde urethrocystography.
In this procedure, the catheter is placed just into the urethra. It does not enter the bladder. The contrast is then injected retrograde, which literally means against the natural flow, so the imaging can track it backwards through the urethra and the bladder. You might hear this referred to as a double balloon ureterogram or a positive pressure ureterogram. Because the mechanics and the access point are different, the codes are completely different too. Here, you'll use code 74450 for the supervision and interpretation and 51610 for the injection procedure.
But hey, here is a massive red flag you really need to watch out for to avoid double billing. When performing these injection procedures, you must strictly avoid assigning codes 51701, 51702, or 5103. Why? Well, because the catheterization of the bladder is already considered inherently part of the primary procedure. It's bundled in. Also, keep in mind that if a urologist or another practitioner catheterizes the patient and injects the contrast, the radiologist would only assign the appropriate supervision and interpretation code for the imaging study, not the injection codes.
Finally, we've reached Section 6, Antegrade Studies New Access. When a provider does a standalone diagnostic antegrade pyelogram, nephrostogram, or ureterogram through a completely new access point, like a brand new needle or catheter, a lot of those older codes from the past are just thrown out entirely. They're replaced by a single comprehensive code, 5430. This one code covers the whole shebang: the access, the injection of contrast material, the imaging guidance like ultrasound and fluoroscopy, and all the associated radiological supervision and interpretation. Because it is so all-inclusive, you should never separately report code 74425 alongside it. Furthermore, if diagnostic studies are performed at the exact same time as therapeutic procedures, like codes 5432 through 5437 or 5693 through 5695, they're just included in the therapeutic work and are not separately coded.
So we've traced the incredible complex plumbing of the urinary tract, and we've navigated the strict boundaries of exactly how we document and code those procedures. From the one-entity rule of the renal pelvis and ureters to the timing variables of a VCUG and the strict bundles of antegrade studies, it leaves us with an important thought to chew on. In a bodily system that is perfectly designed to eliminate waste and maintain total biological precision, are your coding practices leaving efficiency behind? Ensuring your administrative precision actually matches the biological precision of human anatomy is really what sets a standard of excellence. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you next time.